Let me first thank the Sociologists for Palestine for inviting me to this teach-in to discuss the resolution before us. It's a great honor to be here alongside such distinguished colleagues, and I should like to also recognize Dr. Sabah Khoury for her courage in particular in joining us today. My talk will follow 5 steps. First, to review the history of such resolutions in the ASA. Second, how these resolutions, and this one in particular, are consistent with the ASA's policy of public engagement. Third, such resolutions, and again, this one in particular, not only follow from moral and political commitments of the ASA, but are rooted in the foundations of sociology. And fourth, to show that councils, that is the leading body we elected of the ASA, the Council's case for rejecting the resolution, especially when set next to the resolution itself, simply fails to address the issue at hand. And finally, fifth, ceasefire benefits all parties. Ceasefire will benefit all parties within and beyond Israel-Palestine. So, to my first step. The ASA has a long history of resolutions. Many have concerned national and international politics. To my knowledge, the first one was the resolution to end the war in Vietnam, rejected by Council and then rejected by the membership itself. That was 1967. Council also rejected the 2003 resolution against the war in Iraq, but it was then passed by the membership with a 2/3 majority. Among the resolutions Council itself endorsed was one calling for divestment from South African companies in 1986, and most recently, in 2022, public condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I should add that there have been repeated attempts at developing a resolution around Israel-Palestine, but none ever left Council. The point is this: voting on such policy issues has been a long-standing practice of the ASA, and it has often involved a clash between the Council and the membership. Moreover, and this is my second step, the ASA has explicitly supported what it calls public engagement, campaigning for government research funding, opposing threats to academic freedom, as in Florida's recent legislation, preparing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court concerning such questions as affirmative action, and supporting the practice of community engagement. In short, the ASA publicly not only defends the interests of sociology as an academic discipline, but also regularly takes positions of a broader political character. It adds up to one thing: the sociologists are actors in the society that we study. We can no longer, if we ever could, retreat to a dispassionate objectivity within the walls of academia. If politicians can set in motion forces that remove leaders of major universities, if they can remove sociology as a basic education requirement within the university, if they can ban the books we teach and abolish DEI, then merely proclaiming our credentials as a science, important though it is, will never be an adequate defense. Retreat is no defense against the political encroachment on university autonomy and more broadly civil society. Now is the time to also stand up for the moral principles that brought so many of us to sociology, the commitment to egalitarianism and freedom that drove Marx, to solidarity and equality of opportunity that drove Durkheim, to liberal democracy and individual autonomy that drove Weber, to the notions of racial justice that drove Du Bois, to gender justice that drove feminism, and so on. Our moral science not only guides our research, it places a heavy burden on the truth it reveals, leading in turn to the deepening or readjustment of our moral commitments. How then does this idea of moral science, a science built on moral principles, relate to the resolution before us? I now offer my third step, which begins with a throwback to the critical sociology of the 1960s. In his famous 1966 address to the Society for the Study of Social Problems, Howard Becker asks, "Whose side are we on?" His answer is unequivocal. Sociologists inevitably, unavoidably, whether for political or practical reasons, take sides, and for the most part, we take the side of the underdog. Even when we study overdogs, we do so from the standpoint of the underdog. Sociology redeems the humanity of underdogs by studying the way they adapt to subjugation, as, for example, the way Palestinians respond to a century of violent dispossession, expulsion, and silencing. In his fierce rebuttal Sociologist as partisan, Alvin Goldner takes Becker to task. First, it is not always clear who is the underdog. Underdogs create their own underdogs, just as overdogs have their own hierarchy. Accordingly, Goldner accuses Becker of blaming the immediate overdogs, the police, the social worker, and other street-level bureaucrats, for the plight of their wards. Becker thereby misses, according to Goldner, and obscures the real culprit, namely the state, that employs these caretakers to oversee the poor. Moreover, this same state frequently supports the sociologists with funds and jobs for the social control of the indigent. In short, sociologists are on their own side too. In the Israeli case, sociologists and anthropologists, with diminishing exceptions, have become accomplices of the Israeli state. But more than that, we too are accomplices, complicit with the US state's policy in the Middle East, in particular its continuous supply of arms to Israel, feeding the war in Gaza while starving its people. Goldner, no less than Becker, demands we take a stand. However, rather than constitute the underdog as adapting to domination, Goldner views underdogs as resisting domination, collectively or individually, and making history, and being present in the making of their own history. Of course, that comes with its own dilemmas, as the actions of the underdog can be as brutal as those of the overdog. So taking a leaf from Weber, Goldner goes on to say that we should not ask whose side we are on, but what moral values we stand for. For Goldner, the overarching value is to minimize unnecessary suffering. In this way, can one commensurate the suffering of the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians? Is the killing of 1,200 Jews and taking more than 200 hostages equal to the indiscriminate slaughter of over 30,000 Palestinians, their confinement in Gaza, the cumulative dispossession starting, if not in 1917, then in 1948? Does the memory of one Holocaust and the fear of a second justify the extermination of another race? If sociologists condemn the Holocaust, how can they not condemn the Nakba of nearly 80 years? It is in this light that I take my fourth step, Council's explanation for opposing the resolution. The abstract defense of academic freedom may appear innocent and well-meaning, but when placed alongside the resolution, it appears to be not only but callous. It refuses to examine whose academic freedom is being violated and how. Long before October 7th, the academic freedom of Palestinian students and faculty was violated by controlling their geographical movement. Now it is violated far more egregiously by the physical destruction of colleges and the killing of faculty. If sociology is the study of inequality, how can Council overlook the assassination of academic freedom for Palestinians? And, one might add, the slow dissolution of academic freedom in for Israeli academics themselves. Following Pierre Bourdieu, we can say the dominators too are dominated by their domination. Let me turn to my fifth step, the question of ceasefire. In his sympathetic biography of the militant abolitionist John Brown, W.E.B. Du Bois concludes, the price of liberty is less than the cost of repression. And as the latter increased during the first half of the 19th century in the United States, so the insurrection of John Brown became the dress rehearsal for civil war. Whether October 7th be the John Brown moment of today or not, sociologists cannot treat Palestine-Israel as incomparable or as unique. There are distinct parallels in the histories of the United States, Australia, Algeria, Northern Ireland, and many more countries. As species of settler colonialism, they demonstrate that ceasefires were necessary, if not sufficient, to bring about any reconciliation. South Africa is an especially important case, as the emergency period of the 1980s saw escalating violence between colonizer and colonized. Yet both sides were still able to draw back from the brink in a negotiated transition. Strikes and stayaways were hurting business. The Soviet Union was not prepared to arm the ANC for a war of liberation. And most crucially, the US Congress passed the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, I might say over Reagan's veto. There was a dramatic shift in the US perception of the ANC from a terrorist organization to a liberation movement. But that shift was a product of mobilizations in civil society, and most significantly, mobilizations on university campuses, with sociologists at the forefront. Looking across the campuses of today, one cannot mistake the parallels. And it is no accident that it was South Africa that charged Israel with genocide at the ICJ. The US state ended the wars of 1967 and 1973 early on by signaling to the Israeli state enough was enough. So far today, it has failed to impose similar sanctions on the Israeli state. A state blind to its own interests, a state trapped by its own arrogance, provoking wider conflagration in the region and beyond. Sociology teaches us that immediate and permanent ceasefire, if not sufficient, is certainly necessary, not just for the protection of Palestinian lives, but for the savior of Israel, and not just for Israel, but for Jews everywhere who face ever great anti-Semitism precisely because of the inhumane cruelty conducted in their name. How can US sociologists not join the mounting chorus for an immediate and permanent ceasefire? And with that question, I end my talk. Thank you.